Let's go ahead and have our seat. Our next speaker is Stephen Hardin. Stephen Hardin is a professor of history at the Victoria College in Victoria, Texas. He has a BA and MA degrees from history from the Southwest Texas State University and a PhD from TCU. He is author of The Texas Rangers, the award-winning Texan Iliad, a military history of the Texas Revolution, and the Alamo 1836 Santa Ana's Texas Campaign, which was published last year. In addition, Dr. Hardin is editor of The Lone Star, The Republic of Texas, 1836 to 1846, and is the author of more than a dozen scholarly articles that have been published on both sides of the Atlantic. When not engaged in the classroom, he appears regularly as a commentator on American television. Distinguished for his readable style and his accessible approach to history, Dr. Hardin is an inductee of the Texas Institute of Letters and is a member of the Western Writers of America. He lives in Victoria with his wife, Deborah, and his children, Walker and Savannah. His topic today is Houston's generalship, the method, the meaning, and the myth. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Hardin. Where is he? There he is. Thank you very much.
Jeff, thank you for that warm and generous introduction. It's a real treat for me to be here. It's nice to get out of Victoria and into the big city. In fact, I was just thinking if I were in Victoria now, I would be preparing to deliver a lecture. But I'm sure you pay more attention than my students do, so it's nice to speak to an audience who actually is interested in what you have to say. Where's Jim? My friend Jim Haley, and we really are friends. I've been amused, as he has, at how this has been promoted, sort of like an academic Jerry Springer show. We really are friends, and that's why I'm able to say such terrible things about him. But remember, and what I think non-academics sometimes forget, it's part, and Jim Crisp can confirm this, that part of our graduate school training is sitting in seminars and having people just savage us. So we develop very thick skins, and when we hear someone attack our findings, we don't take it personally. Our first instinct is to say, now how can I refute that? So again, I think Jim is a wonderful person. He's a good friend. I do think he's wrong about some things, and that's okay. That's okay. I'm wrong all the time. Just ask my wife. General Sam Houston and I are alike in at least one way. We both have our fair share of critics. In 1994, I published Texian Iliad, a military history of the Texas Revolution. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, and the book won a number of prestigious awards. Recently, Texas bibliophile Mike Cox listed the volume in more basic books and wrote the following. On the Texana bookshelf, Texian Iliad should stand as a classic, every bit as enduring as the epic poem referred to in its title. Please. Will people be reading my Iliad 2,000 years hence? Somehow I doubt it, but I appreciate Mike's kindness. Nevertheless, my unflattering assessment of Houston's generalship perturbed some reviewers. My friend Margaret Henson minced no words. Of course, she rarely did. Those of you who know or knew Margaret, and don't you miss her? Don't you miss Margaret Henson? But this is what Margaret said. The first 6 chapters, focusing on events leading to the Alamo and Goliad, are the main strength of this book. Hardin's bias against Sam Houston lessens the impact of the remaining chapters. Margaret's criticism hurt me not only because I held her in such high esteem, but also because I had tried so hard to be impartial to all the participants. But therein lies the rub. Freedom of academic inquiry seemingly does not extend to Sam Houston, the grand champion of Texas sacred cows. In 1996, I published an article on the Alamo de Parras website in which I addressed those who claimed that I had been unfair to Houston's memory. The piece moldered blissfully unnoticed until Dallas Morning News columnist Kent Biffle discovered it and ran a feature wherein he outlined my major points. Suddenly, I found myself in a tempest. Granted, the tempest confined itself to a minuscule teacup. After all, how many people actually care about Houston's generalship? More than you'd think. I know, I heard from most of them. My friend Jim Haley unleashes the latest barrage in his new biography, Sam Houston. He lumps me with other revisionists who presume to question his hero's reputation. He accuses me of employing poisoned sources. He castigates the tone of my Alamo de Parras piece as stridently expressed. He includes me in the society of those, and this one's my favorite, those latter-day grinders of the axe of revisionism. The boy can write. Any effort to offer a detached critical analysis of Houston's generalship is hindered by his legend. To Texans, Sam Houston is no mere hero. Immigrants who came to Texas in the wake of San Jacinto made him an icon of patriotic faith, the homegrown military genius, the indispensable man to whom Texas owed their independence. But not all shared such glowing assessments of Houston. Many, indeed most, of those who had served with him during the 1836 campaign insisted that he had exaggerated his contributions to advance his political ambitions. They claimed he attempted to avoid battle at San Jacinto and appropriated laurels that properly belonged to the common Texian soldiers. Houston biographers from Lester to Haley have dismissed his critics as spiteful subordinates, covetous of their commander's renown, and largely ignored anything they had to say. Yet objective historians can no longer simply ignore the sheer number of the general's detractors. Those familiar with the events of the San Jacinto campaign find much of the criticism well-founded. Students of Texas history need to set aside the hagiography penned by political hacks and hero worshipers to gain a fresh perspective on Houston's generalship during the campaign. Social and political historians eagerly accept the traditional view that San Jacinto was the culmination of Houston's wily strategy, and most Texans readily embrace that belief. Even so, the San Jacinto campaign does provide a number of instructive problems for serious students, and I would like to address some of those today. Now, I have, being the old classroom teacher, I have handouts, and some of you have those and some of you don't. If you don't have the documents, would you raise your hand and somebody will endeavor to get those to you? It seems like most of the people, though, how did you get so neglected? We have, Jeff, do we have somebody who can hand those out from? Well, we have boxes over here, Jeff. If we could just get them to the folks.
Right here.
Okay. Now, I only printed up 250. I think we have about 280, and I apologize. We didn't anticipate quite this many people, but we'll get them, and some of you can perhaps look on with your neighbor. Say, I am an old classroom teacher. So while these are being handed out, let's begin to discuss some of the problems. Problem one, was Houston a skillful strategist? Santana's winter offensive, although imposing dreadful hardships on his soldados, caught Houston by surprise and secured the momentum. Texians did not expect the Mexicans to strike until mid-March at the earliest, and were woefully ill-prepared to meet the onslaught. Until the single knockout punch, Houston was dancing to a tune orchestrated by Santana. In fact, Houston had initially refused to believe that the enemy had launched their attack. Robert Coleman, the general's bitterest critic, asserted that Houston dismissed appeals from Travis and Fannin as a fraud that had been practiced upon the people by the officers of the frontier for party purposes, end quote. Now, Jim's right. Considering Coleman's animus toward Houston, one would be inclined toward skepticism if his account were not corroborated by an independent source. While on his way from the Independence Convention at Washington to Gonzales, Houston lingered at Burnham's Ferry on the Colorado. Although Houston had pledged all mortal power to relieve the Alamo garrison, according to settler W.W. Thompson, the general lingered at Burnham's, quote, all night and all day and all night again. While Texians were racked with anxiety concerning the fate of Travis and his men, their general dawdled. Why? When Thompson inquired about the plight of the Alamo defenders, he received an amazing reply. Houston swore that he believed it to be a damn lie, and that all those reports from Travis and Fannin were lies, for there were no Mexican forces there, and that he believed that it was only electioneering schemes on the part of Travis and Fannin to sustain their own popularity. Now, in your documents packet, I have given you well, not the actual document, but a Xerox copy of the actual Thompson letter or affidavit, which I suppose few people have actually gotten to see. Now, Jim excoriates me for giving any credence to the Thompson document. He believes that the prudent researchers should ignore the Thompson affidavit because it was, Jim's words now, sworn to an official of Mirabeau Lamar's State Department at a time when government minions were always looking to swear in somebody to say something defamatory about Houston, close quote. Point one. Jim glibly states that during the time in question, Lamar's minions were always attempting to defame the general. Problem is, I'm not sure that's true. I looked in his notes for substantiation of such an assertion, but sadly he did not think it merited a citation. If I were possessed of a more trusting nature, I'd simply take Jim's word for it, but call me old-fashioned, I still like to see the evidence. But he does raise an interesting question. If Thompson and the government minions trumped up the affidavit to smear Houston, why didn't they ever employ it to that purpose? The document sat unnoticed in the Texas State Archives until the early 1990s and went unpublished until it appeared in Texian Iliad in 1994. If, as Jim insists, this was a nefarious scheme to slander Houston, the minions made a mighty poor job of it. Point 2. Thompson made his statement on December 1st, 1840. Of course, Thompson swore to a Lamar official because he was president at the time. Who else could he have given the statement to? One gathers from Jim's tone that historians ought to eschew all Texas documents generated between December 1838 and December 1841, which is to say Lamar's tenure in office, as poisoned. That is, of course, unless the documents speak approvingly of old Sam Jacinto. Point 3. Jim contends that the affidavit loses its little credibility when Thompson claims that Houston said that there were no Mexican forces in Bear. But Jim cannot know what Houston told Thompson. He argues that it does not appear reasonable that Houston would say one thing in his March 2nd broadside and contradict himself just days later. But this is exactly the sort of behavior that drove Houston's contemporaries to the point of apoplexy. Indeed, it is entirely likely that the Thompson affidavit accurately illustrates Houston's duplicity. This was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that Houston voiced one statement for the public but expressed a different private opinion when the public was out of earshot. Point 4. But I'm glad that Jim should bring up the March 2nd broadside, which I've included in your packet. Take a close look at that document. If one looks at the body of the document, Houston's intent seems clear. The citizens of Texas must rally to the aid of our army or it will perish. Let the citizens of the East march to the combat. In his postscript, however, he forcefully parries the thrust of his original message. Now again, this is the postscript. It is rumored that the enemy are on the march to Gonzales and that they have entered the colonies. The fate of Bear is unknown. The country must and shall be defended. Now, do you see what he's done here, friends? In one breath, Houston urges the public to rush to the relief of the Alamo. In the next, he insinuates that the Alamo may have already fallen, the enemy is on the doorstep, and Texians should prepare to defend their homes. Could it be that as early as March 2nd, Houston was already preparing his case for withdrawal? The March 2nd broadside also reveals Houston's hypocrisy. On 11 March, the same day that Houston finally arrived in Gonzales, 2 Bejareños galloped into town to report the fall of the Alamo. According to Juan Seguin, their report was so detailed as to preclude any doubts about the disastrous event. Nevertheless, Houston arrested the pair as centralist spies. While publicly disparaging their intelligence, the general privately admitted in a letter to Colonel James Walker Fannin that he feared a melancholy portion of it will be found true. Houston later claimed that he attempted to quash reports concerning the fall of the Alamo because of the panic they would create. In a March 15th communique to James Collinsworth, Houston laments that 20 of his men had deserted from the first sensation produced by the intelligence. He then derides the deserters for circulating damaging rumors. They have disseminated throughout the frontier such exaggerated reports that they have preceded dismay and consternation among the people to a most distressing extent. But friends, read once again the postscript to the March 2nd broadside. Houston himself was the first to float the rumor that the Alamo might have already fallen 4 days before it actually did. Point 5. Any historian would be foolish to trust the affidavit because W.W. Thompson was a Lamar toady who never missed any opportunity to disparage Houston. Oh, really? Austin researcher Thomas Ricks Lindley has recently uncovered a fascinating document, and I am indebted to him for allowing me to share it with you today. On 20 November 1841, an Austin committee penned a letter of welcome and congratulation to the new president. The tone of the missive was fawning. The people, therefore, no longer deceived and misled, have commended themselves to the world and again rallying around you as their favorite and beloved head to prescribe the course of deliverance from the evils of the past, still operating, and those resulting from our present external relations and internal conditions. And I've given you the whole text of the letter, so you can read the whole thing at home. The president, of course, was Sam Houston, but one of the signatories was none other than W.W. Thompson. Clearly, Thompson was not the spiteful Houston hater that Jim would have us believe. And if that much is true, Thompson's affidavit acquires considerably more credibility than Jim wants us to believe. Could Houston have really been so clueless? Well, yes. Recall, Houston was not a career soldier, but a career politician. He was conditioned to weigh political considerations first and had not shifted his thinking to accept the possibility that there were those in Texas not involved in a Byzantine power play. By the time Houston began thinking like a general, Santana had stolen a march on him, the Alamo had fallen, and the enemy was driving toward the settlements. Houston's decisions to concentrate his forces on the Colorado was perforce not so much a calculated strategy, but an act of desperation. But to be fair, the factious politicos in the Texas provisional government must bear their portion of the blame, but even so, General Houston does not deserve high marks as a strategic planner. Problem 2. Should Houston have attacked Ramirez y Sesma on the Colorado? Texian soldiers greeted Houston's orders to abandon the Colorado River line with utter contempt. Eager to avenge the Alamo slaughter, they believed they could have defeated the Mexican columns across the river. Houston, however, never gave them the chance. 1,300 Americans retreating before a division of 800 Mexicans, Coleman spat. Can Houston's strong partisans presume to excuse such dastardly cowardice under the pretense of laudable prudence? 11 years later, Dr. Anson Jones berated Houston for abandoning the Colorado line. A stand here would have saved the country from the widespread and universal desolation and suffering which the retreat occasioned east of this river. And this was a consideration which, other things being equal, no military man could have disregarded without censure, as it could very easily have been foreseen. In a military point of view, therefore, the retreat is without any reason and can be accounted for in but two ways. First, the cowardice or ignorance of General Houston, or second, his design to cross the Neches. In either case, he should be held accountable for the ruin brought upon Texas and the immeasurable amount of suffering and misery entailed upon her helpless citizens, her women and children, by that measure. Like all good soldiers, the rebels wished to test themselves in battle, to engage the enemy and kill him. But even if it had resulted in a Texas victory, an engagement at Beeson's Crossing would have been costly and accomplished little. Houston evaluated the strategic realities, and this is the general. While in camp on the Colorado, it was learned that Fannon's regiment had been captured and that Ramirez y Sesma, across the river from us, was in communication with Urrea and Gaona. Urrea could therefore cross the Colorado at Hardin, about 40 miles below the Texian camp, with his 1,500 men and attack our left flank. Gaona, with a force of about 750, could cross the Colorado at Bastrop, about 60 miles above the Texian camp, and attack the right flank, while Sesma could attack the front. Crossing a river under fire and attacking Ramirez y Sesma in his entrenchments would have been so destructive to the Texas Army that it would have stood no chance in the engagements that would surely follow. A battle should serve the needs of strategy. A general does not launch a needless assault merely to quench his men's thirst for blood. There was only one reasonable course: retreat, keep his force intact, and pray Santana made a mistake. One does not have to be a Houston partisan, and nobody's ever called me one of those, to acknowledge that on this occasion, he made the right call. And please mark on your calendar that Steve Hardin said something good about Sam Houston. Problem 3. Did Houston intend to turn south at the Whichway Tree? No, he did not. In 1837, Robert Coleman quoted Houston as saying the following while still at Gross's plantation: "So soon as it is ascertained in camp that the enemy is at San Felipe, half the army will be teasing me to fight. I am, however, commander-in-chief. I will retreat to the Redlands. I will immediately issue marching orders, and a retreat shall be commenced as soon as possible." Now that's what Coleman says. Dr. Anson Jones was equally certain of Houston's intentions. General Houston's policy was to retreat beyond the Neches and beyond the line which General Gaines of the United States Army would have defended. But Houston was forced by the men of his army to depart from this policy and go to Lynchburg, from which resulted the Battle of San Jacinto. And Jones reiterated this point elsewhere. Again, this is Dr. Anson Jones. This plan to retreat to the Neches was defeated by the determination of the Texas troops, by which General Houston was forced on the 15th April 1836 to deflect from the road to Nacogdoches, Gaines Ferry, and Fort Jessup, and to take the one which led to San Jacinto. A controversial issue, an incident along the Harrisburg Road, corroborated all the assertions that Houston intended to march toward the border. Pamela Mann had allowed the Army to borrow a team of prized oxen. Mrs. Mann apparently expressed concern for her animals, but the general assured her that he was taking the Army and her oxen to the Redlands and out of harm's way. Obviously, she did not want these beasts to be killed or captured by the Mexicans. When she discovered that the rebels had turned to the right, she mounted up and rode after her property. According to Private Robert Hancock Hunter, who witnessed the confrontation, she rode up to the general and said, "General, you told me a damn lie. You said you was going on the Nacogdoches Road." Coleman related essentially the same story. As he told it, Mrs. Mann charged Houston with duplicity. "I loaned you the oxen to go to the Trinity. As you have changed your route, I shall take them." Now with that, the brassy widow cut her oxen from the traces and led the beast away. Mrs. Mann should not have been so hard on the general. After all, when he told her he intended to march his army to the Neches, he had meant it. It will surprise no one that Jim takes me to task for repeating a century-old calumny as newfound gospel. And let's review his argument toward the top of page 141 in the segment from his marvelous new book, Sam Houston, which I've provided for you. And Jim, I hope your publisher won't sue me for Xeroxing pages out of your book. I didn't get their permission first. Now again, this is at the page of 141 in Sam Houston. It's beginning with the words revisionist intent. Revisionist intent. Are you with me? Okay. Revisionist intent on proving Houston a cant and coward have since seized upon Labode's rendering of the Pamela Mann incident as proof of their position. What they have less luck explaining is why Houston would confide his strategy to some homespun virago when he kept his counsel away from even his own officers. And then the parenthetical remark, for good reason, as some of his aides were conduits straight back to Burnett and Potter. Of course, the non-combatant refugees were indeed heading up the Nacogdoches Fork, and it is possible that Houston told Mann that her animals would accompany that group. It is equally likely that he would have told her anything to get his hands on her oxen. Point one. For the record, I have never written that Houston was a coward. I've said some truly tacky things about him, but I've never said that the man was a coward. In fact, I've said quite the opposite. The technique Jim employs here is called setting up a straw man, which is to say, attributing an argument to one's challenger that is easy to knock down. Historians frown on that practice. Jim may assert that since he wrote revisionist in the plural, he did not intend to single me out specifically. If so, however, why am I the only one cited in footnote 30? Point two. I have no idea why Houston confided his strategy to Mrs. Mann, but both Hunter and Coleman specifically recalled that Mrs. Mann said that Houston had told her a damn lie. That was why she was so livid. Women are funny that way. They have behaved much the same way when they've caught me lying to them. Point three, reread Jim's paragraph. He stresses that it defies all reason that Houston would have told his plans to some homespun virago, but then his last sentence concludes, that if he did tell her, well, it was just a lie. Jim's logic is positively Clintonian. This line of reasoning didn't work for President Clinton. It doesn't work for Jim. Point 4. 4 participants. If you know of more, please tell me. But I've been able to find 4 participants who discuss Pamela Mann and the oxen incident. Robert Coleman, Nicholas Labadie, Robert Hancock Hunter, and James Washington Winters. For your perusal, I have provided the germane passages from all of their accounts. I encourage everyone to take them home and scrutinize each carefully. There will be an exam on Monday. Coleman's account appeared in 1837, Labadie's in 1859. Hunter wrote his in 1860, but it did not see the light of day until 1936. The Quarterly of the Texas State Historical Association published Winter's reminiscences in 1902. The span over which the 4 accounts appeared argues against collusion. We do not have a vast right-wing conspiracy here. Jim seems to favor the Winters pro-Houston report. He observes, aside from Surgeon Labadie, another in Houston's army who left a memoir was James Washington Winters, a 19-year-old infantryman who had none of the latter political pretensions of the general's detractors. How curious, how easily he ignores Hunter's account. It is certain that one must count Coleman and Labadie among the general's detractors. Yet Hunter, who penned the most detailed version of the incident, was not overtly political. Indeed, he wrote his memoir for his children and signed it, "Your father, R.H. Hunter." Hunter never expected anyone outside his immediate family to read his chronicle. What reason would he have had to lie? The distinguished historian Carlos Castañeda believed Hunter's to be the best account of the Jacinto campaign left by a veteran. He must not have understood how toxic it was. Point 5. Focus for a moment on Hunter's passage. Consider the misspellings, his faulty grammar, and his almost total lack of punctuation. William D. Whitliff, editor of the 1966 Encino Press edition, observed, "There are but 2 periods in the entire piece and not a single paragraph break." Then recall Jim's contention that except for Winters, all versions of this incident are discredited by their political pretensions. Well, he's convinced me. It's evident that behind all of his untutored syntax, old Bob Hunter possessed the diabolical mind of a slick political operative. Point 6. To support his view that Houston intended to turn right at the Whichway Tree, Jim offers as evidence the Robert James Calder account. According to Jim, again, this is out of Sam Houston, as the Army marched toward the Whichway Tree, the unit in the lead was Company K, 1st Regiment under Captain Robert James Calder, a 25-year-old Kentuckian. To the best of my recollection, Calder wrote later, after a short halt at that point, the Nacogdoches Harrisburg Fork, I received an order to take the right-hand road. I do not recollect to have seen or heard any altercation, nor do I think there was any mutinous conduct. Calder's narrative first appeared in the 1861 Texas Almanac, And it began with a telling disclaimer. I have no extraordinary disclosures to make on the secret springs of actions which governed my superiors and might be supposed to regulate the movements of our army, either in retreat or advance. I shall state only what I saw and heard, and shall assume the responsibility of making such comments as in my humble judgment arise from the necessities. And because the Calder account is kind of hard to find, I've given the whole thing to you. You've got the whole Calder account there, and again, take that home and read it. So in essence, Calder is saying, look, I was just a lowly company commander. Nobody ever told me nothing. So I have no idea what Houston or Burleson or Sherman or any of the field grade commanders were really thinking. I'll just recount what I saw. Okay, fair enough. Jim gives the Calder quotation accurately, but not in its entirety. Here's the full passage. And again, you can read this in the Calder. After we left the Brazos, much has been said of a disorderly movement in our army occurring at the forks of the road leading to Harrisburg and eastern Texas. I will only state under this head that my company formed the advance guard of the Army on that and the previous day, and to the best of my recollection, after a short halt at that point, I received an order to take the right-hand road. I do not recollect to have seen or heard any altercation, nor do I think there was any mutinous conduct. When one bothers to examine the full passage, two important elements bob to the surface. Calder makes it clear that he commanded the advance guard. As such, he would have been well ahead of the main Texian army. Of course, Calder would not have seen or heard any altercation at the Whichway Tree because it occurred miles behind him. And remember, Calder swore to relate only what he had witnessed himself. Calder further states that he received an order to take the right-hand road. But from whom? If the order had come directly from General Houston, one would think it would have been a detail that Calder might have mentioned. But the order did not have to come from Houston. It likely came from one of Calder's other superiors acting against the wishes of the commander-in-chief. Reading Jim's Sam Houston, one gets the impression that Calder supported Houston and his strategy, but the following passage is instructive. And again, this passage is from Calder. On April 21st, about the hour of 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, our colonel, Edward Burleson, rode along the line of encampment of his regiment and ordered the captains of the same to meet him at a certain pecan tree, distant some 200 or 300 yards forthwith. They followed on and assembled accordingly, when our colonel told us that he wished to take our vote upon the best time for attacking the enemy, whether immediately or at 4 o'clock the next morning. All the captains but Mosley, Baker, and myself voted for immediate attack. Baker and myself for 4 o'clock in the morning, upon which we were ordered to parade our companies for immediate action. Calder continues, now, as I have said in a former part of this narrative, I was summoned but once to a council of war during the campaign, and the one just stated was the occasion. And as so much has been said about General Houston's reluctance to fight on that occasion, I will simply give my own conclusions, without charging him or believing he felt a positive reluctance to fight. I think he wished, in the case of failure or disaster, an apology, to wit, that he fought against his own judgment and suffered himself to be controlled by the opinions and clamor of his officers and men. I know of no other way of accounting for this counsel. Calder is making every effort to be fair-minded. Still, his statement is hardly a ringing endorsement of Houston's moral courage or his leadership. Before we leave Captain Calder's memoir, we ought to consider one more passage, and this is found toward the end of Calder's account. Okay. In the early enthusiastic days of manhood, General Houston was, in my estimation, the model of a hero and statesman. I followed him to the army and served under him with a devotion akin to that of a Scottish Highlander to his chief. I voted for him for the presidency of the Republic of Texas as long as he was a candidate. But in what a position do I find myself in common with most of the men of that day? If we keep silent, we endorse General Houston's calumnies upon the reputation of those living and dead. We suffer the names of Burnett, Lamar, Wharton, Archer, Sherman, and a host of others to go down to the pages of history with a stigma upon their characters, unchallenged by their contemporaries, and in a few years these witnesses will have passed away. Shall we suffer this, or shall we declare the memory of those who have already gone and the reputation of the survivors are at least as dear to us as the reputation of him who has received all the honors it was in our power to bestow? Point 7. Ladies and gentlemen, please look at the first paragraph on page 140, taken from Jim's Sam Houston. Employing a series of quotations, he tells the story of Pamela Mann and the oxen. One looks in vain for a note to identify the sources of the quotation. The next endnote is number 29. Please consult page 445, notes to pages 135, 141, which I've included in your packet. Endnote 29 does not identify the source of the quotation, but merely references two secondary works. The following footnote number, appropriately enough, is number 30, which appears toward the top of page 141. The endnote number 30 follows this sentence. Revisionist intent on proving Houston a cant and a coward have since seized upon Labody's rendering of the Pamela Mann incident as proof of their position. But friends, here's the kicker. The source I used in Texian Iliad, in my article, The Jacinto Campaign, the Generalship of Sam Houston, and the source that Jim quotes himself on page 140 of Sam Houston is not Labadie. It's Robert Hancock Hunter. You've got all four accounts in front of you. See for yourself. With this in mind, please turn to page 445, notes to pages 135, 141, and read along with me the contents of the fascinating note 30. See, for instance, Hardin, the Jacinto Campaign. However, the resurrection of century-old calumny as newfound gospel is one aspect of revisionism that future historians will likely look back on with little charity. My friends, I find it hard enough to unravel the mysteries of the past. I would not presume to predict the future. Still, if I were a betting man, I adventure that future scholars will likely direct more charity toward me than to scholars, even those of an independent bent, who can't keep their sources straight. But forget what a moment, what Hunter said, forget what Coleman said, what Labadie said, what Winters said, hell, even forget what Steve Hardin says. Houston himself provides the most convincing verification. During the summer of 1845, the old hero addressed a loving crowd in his namesake city. On that day, at least, he was admirably candid. In the course of 2 days at Gonzales, I received the lamentable information that Colonel Travis and his noble compatriots had succumbed to overwhelming numbers and had been brutally slaughtered. I immediately sent a courier to Colonel Fannin, ordering him to destroy all of his artillery that he could not remove and retreat to Victoria. Deaf Smith, having returned from a scout, reported the enemy advancing. I then determined to retreat and get as near to Andrew Jackson and the old flag as I could. What a remarkable admission this is. If Houston was telling the truth, he never intended to fight on the Colorado, nor the Brazos, nor did he intend to veer south at the Whichway Tree. Did Houston lie to his men and his government when he repeatedly said he intended to defend the Texian settlements? Yes. What other conclusion can one reasonably draw? But what does Jim have to say about Houston's admission that as early as March 13th, he had already made up his mind to get as near to Andrew Jackson and the old flag as he could? Jim concedes that Houston said it, but hey, he was only kidding. I am not making this up. In an attempt to explain away the 1845 speech, Jim states the following. The editors of Houston's correspondence note that if this is an accurate transcription, that it was the nearest that Houston ever came to an admission that he planned to retreat to the boundary, and latter-day grinders of the acts of revisionism cite it as compelling evidence that Houston intended flight to the United States. One aspect of this speech that has escaped commentary, however, is that it was made in a folksy jesting context. It was the summer of 1845, and Houston had taken the stump to promote annexation. Naturally, he seized upon any opportunity to allude to Old Hickory and Old Glory. This attitude did not even approach defining Houston's state of mind or intentions on the eve of San Jacinto. Now, it is true that portions of Houston's speech were folksy and jesting. But the inaccuracy of Jim's interpretation derives not from what he says, but instead from what he neglects to say. Earlier in the speech, Houston's demeanor was altogether different. In order to avoid the charge of taking the quotation out of its context, please forgive me if I burden you with a long passage. I have included in your packet the full text of Houston's 1845 speech, and the passage is found on page 8. On the 4th of March, one day after my reappointment and 2 days previous to the fall of the Alamo, at the request of members of the conventions, I proceeded with all possible haste to Gonzales, 5 days, I don't think so, to collect all the armed forces that could be found with the intention of marching to San Antonio and reinforcing Colonel Travis. I arrived at Gonzales on the 6th. Wrong, he arrived on the 11th. And gathered some 350 men fit for service, many of them without arms and ammunition. In the course of 2 days, I received the lamentable information that Colonel Travis and his noble compatriots had succumbed to overwhelming numbers and had been brutally slaughtered. You have to admit, it's been a laugh riot so far. I immediately sent a courier to Colonel Fannin, ordering him to destroy all of his artillery that he could not remove and retreat to Victoria, and informed him of the fall of the Alamo. Deaf Smith, having relied from a scout, reported the enemy advancing. I then determined to retreat and get as near as Andrew Jackson and the old flag as I could. Had Colonel Fannin obeyed my order promptly, his forces and those under his command or my command would have joined several days before his capture and inhuman massacre. These facts, so painful to me to detail to you, I defy any high-minded person to come before me and an intelligent audience and deny. Folksy? Jesting? It may well be that Mr. Haley possesses a better sense of humor than my own, but the only thing I find amusing about this segment of Houston's speech is Jim's explanation. In the opening phase of the Battle of San Jacinto, Houston had arranged the Texians into battle line. After they unleashed their first volley, Houston ordered the men to dress ranks and reload. At that juncture, Secretary of War Thomas J. Rusk galloped along the line, shouting, "If we stop, we are cut to pieces. Don't stop. Go ahead. Give them hell." This seemed admirable advice to the rank and file who, ignoring Houston's commands, rushed headlong toward the enemy. During the heat of the battle, a wounded Houston rode among his men, ordering them to halt the killing of Mexican soldados, many of whom who were trying to surrender. But the vengeful Texians ignored Houston and continued their bloodletting. Observing the uselessness of his efforts, Houston scolded, "Gentlemen, I applaud your bravery, but damn your manners." But no matter. Texians had long since stopped listening to Houston. And this is why I find Jim's profession of faith so curious. Couldn't the Texians have ignored someone else just as easily as they ignored General Houston? Like all the great man's biographers, however, Jim allowed himself to be seduced by the mythology that had its origins in the Houston spin machine. The Houston legend has always required that the true believer coat their hero with a Nietzschean gloss. Houston was the Superman, the prescient intellect whose vision far surpassed that of lesser men. And if his faults were colossal, so too were his talents. After all, one does not judge a colossus by the mob's niggling parameters. Houston was no mere hero, he was the Texas Messiah. Witness this passage from The Raven. The ascending eloquence and earnestness put one impressionable young soldier in the mind of the halo encircling the brow of our Savior. Of course, the messianic metaphor cannot be complete without those benighted and backward apostates who refused to receive the gospel. In the Houston literature, the men of the Texian army fulfilled the Judas function. They have none of the great man's visions. They are vulgar malcontents, shallow conformists, and self-absorbed Philistines. They are Untermenschen, who lack the grace even to acknowledge their moral and spiritual inferiority to their betters. Jim tells us that Houston was a hero in the Hegelian mold, one who can tell his age what its will is. But the old Texians never needed Sam Houston or anyone else to tell them their will. They were some of the most willful individuals in human history. Like Calder, they resented those who characterized them as undisciplined yahoos to make the great man appear even greater. The veterans knew that it had been the nameless, much maligned footsloggers who had done the hard, dirty work. And at the end of that gory, vengeful day on Buffalo Bayou, they also knew who had really won the Battle of San Jacinto. Blinded by Houston's dazzle, Texans have never fully appreciated the real achievement of these recalcitrant yahoos. Thus, we have been unable to employ such knowledge to reinterpret and redefine our history to arrive at something approaching public maturity. Someday, perhaps we can. Thank you very much.